The year was 3037. Humanity had long since left Earth, spreading across the stars, settling on planets far from the home they once knew. Space exploration had become a way of life, and with it, the discovery of ancient relics and lost technologies that often brought more questions than answers. Captain Jake Hunter of the Starship Reference stood at the front of his crew, his eyes focused on the massive, derelict vessel floating in the distance. It was old, the metal worn and pitted by time. It looked like a ghost ship, a relic of a bygone era. They had received a faint distress signal from it days earlier, and now they had arrived at the source. "Get ready for the boarding procedure," Jake ordered, his voice calm but firm. His crew, a mix of experienced explorers, prepared their gear and equipment. They had seen strange things in their time, but nothing like this. This ship felt different, as if it carried a story that needed to be told. Once aboard the ship, the crew discovered a strange and eerie silence. The air was thick with dust, and the lights flickered sporadically. It was as though the ship had been abandoned for centuries, maybe longer. But then they found something. Hidden deep in the heart of the ship was a chamber, cold and locked away. Inside the chamber was a figure, frozen in time. A woman, lying motionless in a stasis pod. Her skin was pale, her hair long and dark, but her face, though aged, was beautiful. Jake couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward her. There was something in her eyes, even though they were closed. He stepped forward, his gloved hands moving carefully over the controls of the pod. The rest of the crew watched, silent and curious. "You think she's still alive?" Lieutenant Daniels asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer at first. He stared at the woman in the pod. His fingers hovered over the control panel, unsure. They were trained for many things, but reviving something like this, something so old, was not one of them. He had heard rumors of lost civilizations, of people who had gone to sleep for hundreds of years, but this was different. Finally, he pressed the button. The pod hummed to life. A soft, rhythmic whirring noise filled the room as the stasis field began to dissolve. The woman's body shuddered, and then, slowly, her chest rose and fell in a faint breath. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Was it possible? Could she really have been in stasis for all this time? The crew gathered closer, their breath caught in their throats. "Captain, what's happening?" Daniels asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jake didn't have the answer. He was just as confused as the rest of them. But one thing was clear. The woman was alive, or at least, she was beginning to come back to life. The stasis pod opened fully, and the woman slowly sat up, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, disoriented, her gaze fixed on Jake for a moment. And then slowly, she seemed to register her surroundings. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that made sense. But there was nothing but silence. Jake stepped forward cautiously, his hand extended. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before. She was like a ghost from the past, someone who had been lost to time. Are you all right?" he asked softly, unsure of the words. The woman's head turned sharply toward him. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, but there was also a strange curiosity in them. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She seemed to struggle to breathe, her chest heaving, as though she hadn't used her lungs in centuries. "It's okay," Jake said gently, trying to reassure her. He took another step forward, his hand still extended. "We're not here to hurt you. We're just trying to help." The woman's breathing slowed, but she still didn't speak. She looked up at Jake again, studying him. There was something about her, something otherworldly. Her clothes were strange, unlike anything Jake had seen before. And there was a coldness to her, a feeling that she didn't belong here. But her eyes, the way they locked onto his, seemed to speak a language he couldn't understand. And then, for the first time, she spoke. "My heart," she whispered hoarsely. It stopped. Jake's heart raced as he heard her words. What was she saying? Her heart had stopped. He took a step back, glancing at his crew. Daniels looked as confused as he felt. "I'm Lyra," the woman said, her voice weak but clear. "Lyra, it's been so long." The words trailed off, and she sank back into the pod, overwhelmed. Jake quickly moved to her side, kneeling down. "Lyra, can you tell me what happened?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "What happened to you?" Lyra's eyes fluttered shut again, and for a moment, Jake thought she had fallen back into a deep sleep. But then, her hand reached out, grasping his wrist with surprising strength. Her grip was cold, but there was a spark in her touch, as if something inside her was starting to wake up. "I don't remember," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "But I remember. My heart. It stopped. And now, it's beating again." Jake's eyes widened. She was alive, but more than that. Her heart, her very essence, had returned. And now, it seemed that something greater than just a long-forgotten woman was awakening. Something that could change everything. Lyra sat in the medical bay of the Reverence, her hands trembling as she looked at the strange surroundings. The ship hummed softly around her, the air filled with the scent of technology and antiseptic. It felt so foreign to her. Nothing about this place felt real, and everything she saw seemed like a dream. She was no longer in the world she had known. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the walls and the screens around her. She felt exhausted, as if the weight of time itself was pressing down on her chest. The memories, fragmented and incomplete, drifted in and out of her mind like clouds passing in a storm. Jake stood by the doorway, watching her with a mix of concern and curiosity. He had seen many things in his years as a captain, but nothing like this. Lyra's appearance was both mesmerizing and confusing. She looked so out of place, so lost in a world that had moved on without her. Yet there was something about her, something beyond her appearance that made Jake feel like he needed to help her. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked gently. His voice was steady, but there was a softness to it that made Lyra look up at him. "I don't know," she replied, her voice shaky. "I feel like I've woken up from a long, long sleep, but I don't remember how I got here." She ran a hand through her hair, her face clouded with confusion. Jake took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're safe now," he said reassuringly. "We found you on an old ship, and we've brought you aboard ours. It's the year 3037. You've been in stasis for a long time." Her eyes widened slightly as she processed his words. 3037. She repeated the number as if trying to make sense of it. I don't understand. It was so long ago. My mission. It was all for nothing." Jake's brow furrowed. "Mission? What mission?" Lyra closed her eyes, as though the act of speaking drained her strength. The pain of remembering seemed too much for her to bear. Slowly, she took a deep breath and began to speak again, her voice quieter now, as if the words were coming from deep within her soul. "I was part of a group. Soldiers, explorers, scientists, tasked with protecting Earth. There was a war with an alien race, the Anraxi. They came from beyond the stars, and they were unstoppable. They wanted to take everything, to destroy humanity. We tried to fight them. We tried to stop them." Jake listened intently. He had heard of the Anraxi, a name that sent a shiver down anyone's spine. They were a deadly race, known for their brutal tactics and their nearly indestructible ships. But he had never known the full story, never heard of any human force that had fought them. Lyra's eyes were distant now, as though she was no longer in the medical bay but back in the past, reliving the events she spoke of. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "We were part of a secret mission," she said, her hands clasping together tightly. "We were going to stop the Anraxi, to find a way to stop them once and for all. But it wasn't just a war, it was a trap. The Anraxi, they had spies within our ranks. They knew about us before we even got there." Jake's mind raced. A spy, within their own ranks. The idea seemed impossible. But then again, the Anraxi were not a race to be underestimated. I was... Lyra paused, a flash of pain crossing her face. I was the leader of that mission. I thought I could save everyone, that we could win. But I was wrong. We were betrayed. Her voice faltered, and for a moment, she looked like she might break down completely. But instead, she held herself together, her eyes hardening with determination. I was the one who failed. I thought I could hold on, that I could finish what we started. But I couldn't. She looked at Jake then, her gaze piercing. I sacrificed myself to stop them. I went into stasis to ensure that the Anraxi would never find the weapon we had created, the key to their destruction. It was my duty, my responsibility. Jake's heart sank as he realized the weight of her words. Lyra had been a soldier, a leader who had been willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. But in doing so, she had sealed herself away, never knowing if humanity would survive. You saved everyone, Jake said softly, though it felt like an understatement. If you hadn't done that, none of us would be here. Lyra shook her head slowly. I don't feel like a hero. I feel lost. I was supposed to be part of something bigger, but now I'm just a memory. A forgotten piece of history. Jake could see the pain in her eyes, and it made him ache with empathy. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder in an attempt to comfort her. You're not a memory, he said firmly. You're alive. You're here. And whatever happened in the past, we can figure it out together. You're not alone anymore. For a moment, Lyra looked at him, her expression softening. She hadn't expected kindness, especially not from someone who had never known her. But there was something in Jake's words, something that made her believe he meant them. As Lyra sat back against the bed, her eyes closed once more. Jake stood silently by her side. The woman before him had a past filled with pain and sacrifice, but she was also a living reminder of humanity's strength and will to survive. I'm here now, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I can't turn back. I can't ignore what I left behind. Jake nodded. And we'll help you find your way forward. Together. The starship Reverence cruised through the vast emptiness of space. Its engines hummed softly, a calming rhythm that contrasted with the tension inside the ship. Lyra sat in the central control room, staring at the holographic star map projected before her. Her fingers hovered over the glowing interface, but her mind was far from the present. Jake entered the room, his footsteps light but purposeful. He carried 2 steaming cups of synth tea, offering one to Lyra as he took a seat beside her. You've been sitting here for hours, he said gently. Take a break. Lyra glanced at the cup, then at Jake, before giving a small, tired smile. Thanks, she murmured, taking the tea in her hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, grounding her in the moment. You're thinking about them, aren't you? Jake asked, his tone soft. She nodded, her gaze distant. The Anraxi. I remember their ships, the way they appeared out of nowhere, tearing through our defenses like we were nothing. They didn't just want to win. They'd wanted to erase us. Her voice grew quieter, the weight of her memories pressing down on her. And now, they might still be out there, waiting. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're not the same person you were back then, Lyra. You've got us now. We'll face whatever comes together. Before Lyra could respond, the ship's alarm blared. A sharp, mechanical voice filled the room. Unidentified vessel detected. Proximity alert. Repeat. Unidentified vessel detected. Jake and Lyra exchanged a glance before rushing to the control panel. Lyra's hands flew across the interface, bringing up the visual feed of the approaching ship. The screen flickered to life, showing a dark, sleek vessel cutting through space like a predator stalking its prey. It's them, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. The Anraxi. Jake's jaw tightened as he studied the ship's design. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, smooth, organic, and menacing. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine, but he forced himself to stay calm. "They must have detected us when we reactivated your stasis pod," he said. "They've been waiting for this moment." Lyra's breathing quickened, memories of battles and destruction flooding her mind. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. "We need to get out of here," she said. "They'll tear us apart if we try to fight them." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "Daniels," he called into the ship's comms, "get to the engine room and prepare for a jump. We need full power, now." The voice of Lieutenant Daniels crackled through the speakers. "On it, Captain. Engines will be ready in 3 minutes." 3 minutes, Jake muttered. "We'll have to hold them off until then." Lyra's eyes darted to the weapons panel. "Do you have shields?" "Not one strong enough to take a direct hit from that," Jake admitted, gesturing to the Anraxi ship on the screen. Lyra's expression hardened. "We don't need to fight them. We just need to buy time." Her fingers moved quickly, configuring the ship's defense systems. Jake watched her with admiration and concern. She moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, but he could see the strain in her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I've faced them before," she said firmly. "I know how they think. Trust me." The Reverence shuddered as the Anraxi ship fired its first shot. A beam of energy streaked through space, narrowly missing the hull. Jake gripped the console to steady himself. "Whatever you're doing, make it quick." Lyra activated the ship's decoy drones, sending them spiraling toward the enemy ship. The drones emitted a burst of electromagnetic interference, temporarily blinding the Anraxis sensors. "That should slow them down," she said. Jake checked the countdown on the engine room display. 2 minutes left. "They're not going to fall for that for long," he warned. As if on cue, the Anraxi ship adjusted its course, maneuvering around the decoys with unsettling precision. It fired again, this time grazing the Reverence's shields. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the lights flickered. "Shields at 60%, the ship's AI reported. Lyra gritted her teeth. "Come on," she muttered, her fingers dancing over the controls. "Just give us a little more time." Jake reached for the comms. "Daniels, status update." "Engines are almost there, Captain," Daniels replied, her voice strained. Another minute. The Anraxi ship closed the distance, its weapons charging for a final strike. Lyra's heart raced as she stared at the screen. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the lives she had failed to save. But this time, she wasn't alone. "Jake," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I need you to trust me." "I already do," he said without hesitation. Lyra activated the ship's emergency power reserves, diverting energy to the rear thrusters. The sudden burst of speed jolted the Reverence forward, narrowly dodging another blast from the Anraxi ship. At the same time, she deployed a flare, a brilliant burst of light that momentarily blinded the enemy. "Jump ready in 10 seconds, Daniel shouted over the comms. "Hold on," Jake yelled as he grabbed the controls. The Reverence shuddered violently as the jump drive activated. Space around them seemed to twist and bend before the ship was hurled into hyperspace. The stars outside the window stretched into streaks of light before vanishing altogether. Silence filled the control room, broken only by the sound of Lyra's shaky breath. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. Jake turned to her, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You just saved all of us," he said. Lyra shook her head. "They're not going to stop. They'd found me, and now they'll hunt us until they finish what they started." Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll be ready for them. Together." Lyra looked at him, her fear giving way to determination. She had faced the Anraxi before, and she would face them again. This time, she wasn't fighting alone. The stars outside the window of the Reverence stretched into streaks of light as the ship drifted through hyperspace. The hum of the engines had faded, replaced by the silence of space. But the calm was deceiving. The crew knew the danger wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Jake paced the bridge, his boots tapping against the metal floor with each step. His eyes were fixed on the view screen, but his mind was far away, on the Enraxi ship that had nearly destroyed them just hours ago. "We're safe for now." Lyra's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. She stood beside the control panel, her eyes locked on the readings in front of her. "But they're tracking us. They'll find us again." Jake turned to her, his jaw clenched. "How long do we have?" Lyra didn't look at him, her focus still on the data. "Not long. They'll follow our hyperspace trail. The Enraxi can track ships through hyperspace waves." She paused, her expression darkening. "It's only a matter of time before they catch up." A tense silence filled the room. "We need to fight back," Lieutenant Daniel said, her voice sharp. She stood near the weapons console, her arms crossed. "We can't just run forever." Jake shook his head. "Running is all we can do right now. The Enraxi are too powerful. Our weapons won't do much against them." He turned back to Lyra. "You said there was a weapon, a way to stop them. Can we use it now?" Lyra hesitated, her eyes narrowing as the memories of her mission flashed in her mind. The weapon she had been tasked with protecting was hidden in the far reaches of space, deep within enemy territory. It was their last hope, but it came with a cost. "I can lead you to it," she said quietly, "but it's not easy to reach. The Enraxi have fortified their territory, and there are dangers even worse than them out there. We won't be able to just walk in and take it." "We don't have a choice," Jake replied, determination in his voice. "If we don't stop the Enraxi, they'll hunt us down, and we won't survive." Lyra took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew the risks. She knew the price of failure, but the urgency in Jake's voice, the weight of the crew's hopes, pushed her to make the decision. "We'll do it," she said finally, "but we need to prepare. We need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes." The crew gathered around the table, a sense of purpose growing among them. Daniels, the weapons expert, would oversee the ship's defense systems. Lieutenant Grayson, the ship's navigator, would help Lyra chart a course to the weapon. And Jake would lead them through it all. "We'll need everything we've got," Daniel said, her eyes sharp. "Every weapon, every trick we know. If we're going into Enraxi territory, we'll need to be prepared for anything." Lyra nodded. "I'll give you all the information I have. But remember, this isn't just about firepower. It's about strategy. The Enraxi won't just sit back and wait for us to strike. Then we'll hit them hard and fast," Jake said. "We don't have the luxury of time." Hours passed as the crew worked tirelessly, preparing for the journey ahead. The Reverence was a capable ship, but it wasn't built for combat. They had to make do with what they had. Weapons were checked, the shields reinforced, and every crew member was given their assignments. Jake stood at the front of the bridge, watching as the crew worked with focused energy. He could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. This wasn't just a mission to retrieve a weapon. It was a fight for survival. The Enraxi were ruthless, and if they failed, there would be no second chances. Lyra joined him at the front, her gaze distant as she looked at the star map. She knew the route they would take to reach the weapon, but it was dangerous, too dangerous. The Enraxi were watching, waiting for any sign of weakness, and if they followed them through hyperspace, they would have no place to hide. "We need to keep moving," Lyra said, her voice low. "If they're following us, they'll be getting closer. We can't afford to slow down." Jake nodded. "I'll set the course. We jump in 10 minutes. Everyone ready?" The crew gave their confirmations. 10 minutes later, the Reverence shot through hyperspace again, the stars streaking by as the ship pushed forward into the unknown. But the journey ahead was not going to be easy. The Enraxi were relentless. They had already lost one battle, but Jake knew they would not make that mistake again. The enemy had a strange way of tracking their prey, using technology that was far more advanced than anything humanity had developed. The longer they remained in Enraxi space, the greater the risk they took. As the ship moved deeper into enemy territory, tensions mounted. Lyra's mind raced as she tried to remember every detail of the plan, every weakness she had discovered in the Enraxi defenses. But it was hard to think clearly when the weight of the past pressed down on her. The memories of her team, the soldiers she had lost, haunted her, but she had no choice. The mission had changed. This was no longer about just stopping the Enraxi. It was about saving the last hope for humanity's survival. Suddenly, the alarms rang again. The voice of the ship's AI filled the room. Hostile ship detected. Enraxid vessel approaching. Time to contact. 30 seconds. Jake's face hardened. It's them. They found us. Lyra quickly accessed the controls. Brace yourselves. They're coming for us. The crew scrambled to their positions as the ship shook from the impact of a blast. The Enraxi were closing in, and this time, there would be no decoys. They would have to face the enemy head-on. Jake looked at Lyra, his eyes meeting hers with a silent understanding. They had made it this far. Now, they would have to fight for their lives. "Let's finish this," he said. And with that, the Reverence prepared for battle. The Reverence drifted silently through the dark expanse of space, the only sound the steady hum of the ship's engines. The crew was tense, every person on edge, ready for whatever would come next. The Enraxi were out there, waiting for them. Lyra knew they didn't have much time before the enemy would strike. Jake stood at the front of the control room, staring at the blinking lights of the star map. The stars seemed far away now, distant and cold. The warmth of the ship, the noise of its crew, felt like a faint memory compared to the cold, empty space outside. His thoughts were focused entirely on the mission ahead. "Captain!" Grayson's voice broke through the silence, snapping Jake back to the present. "We're entering Enraxi space. We'll be at the target coordinates in 10 minutes. Jake nodded, his gaze hardening. "Everyone, prepare for action. Lyra, what's the status on the weapon?" Lyra, who had been standing quietly by the weapons console, turned toward him. Her eyes were sharp, her expression determined. "It's still there, in a heavily guarded Enraxi fortress. But it's not just the Enraxi we have to worry about. There are automated defenses, traps, and security systems that have been in place for decades. It won't be easy." "Nothing worth fighting for ever is," Jake said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "We're doing this. Everyone's depending on us." Lyra met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude passing through her. She had already made up her mind. There was no going back. The crew was ready. Now, it was time to face the enemy. The Reverence continued to glide forward, the blackness of space pressing in on all sides. Tensions ran high, and every member of the crew was preparing for the unknown. They knew that once they entered the heart of Enraxi territory, there would be no room for mistakes. Suddenly, the ship shuddered. The lights flickered, and the artificial gravity briefly failed before stabilizing again. The alarms blared. "Hostile ship detected," the AI announced coldly. "Enraxi vessel closing in. Time to contact. 60 seconds. Jake's heart raced. It was happening. Now. They weren't going to get much time to reach the weapon, not with the Enraxi right on their tail. "Daniels, take the helm," Jake barked. "Grayson, get us closer to the target. Lyra, are you ready?" Lyra nodded, her fingers already working over the controls. "I've reprogrammed the ship's systems. If we're going to make it through this, we'll need to use every advantage we can." The ship jolted again, more violently this time. A deep rumbling noise echoed through the hull as the Enraxi ship fired its first shot. The energy beam streaked through space, hitting the Reverence's shields with a force that sent the ship reeling. The shield lights flashed red as the impact reverberated through the ship. "Shields at 40%, the AI reported, its voice full of mechanical efficiency. "Keep us steady, Daniels." Jake called over his shoulder. Lyra, are you sure about the weapon's location? Lyra didn't look up from her console. Yes, but we won't be able to get close unless we disable the Anraxi ship. The weapon's inside their fortress on the planet below. We have to land. No other option. Jake grimaced. A planet. The Anraxi wouldn't let them get close without a fight. He turned to Daniels. We're going to need to take them down. All weapons at full power now. Daniels nodded sharply. Aye, Captain. Weapons online. The Reverence rocked again as another shot hit its shields. The crew scrambled to their stations, knowing the next hit could be fatal. Jake grabbed the comms. Prepare to fight back, all crew members. This is our last chance. Lyra worked quickly, coordinating with Daniels to fire the ship's weapons. The Reverence unleashed a series of laser blasts toward the Anraxi ship. But the enemy vessel was too fast, its advanced technology allowing it to dodge most of the shots. They're too good, Grayson muttered from the navigation panel. They're faster than we are. Jake clenched his fists. Then we'll have to make them think we're something else. Lyra's fingers flew over the console again. She quickly activated the ship's cloaking device, momentarily making the Reverence invisible to the Anraxi ship's sensors. They'll lose us for a few minutes, Lyra said, her voice filled with quiet urgency. That should give us time to get closer to the planet. Jake's heart raced. This was it. He glanced at the view screen, his eyes narrowing as he watched the enemy ship's silhouette slowly fade into the background. Get us to the planet, he ordered. Now. The Reverence shot forward, using the brief moment of invisibility to slip past the Anraxi ship and into the atmosphere of the hostile planet. The ship began to descend, the surface growing larger and more dangerous with every passing second. The sky outside was dark and stormy, the clouds swirling ominously as if warning them. As the ship approached the surface, the Anraxi ship reappeared, now trailing behind them. But it was too late. They were already too close. Brace for impact, Jake warned as the Reverence plunged into the planet's atmosphere. The air outside crackled with energy, the ship's hull groaning under the pressure. Lyra gripped the controls tightly, her eyes focused on the landing zone. With a violent shudder, the Reverence slammed into the ground. The ship skidded across the rocky terrain, sparks flying from the underbelly as it scraped against jagged rocks and debris. Finally, it came to a halt, the ship's systems automatically shutting down as the dust settled around them. For a moment, there was silence. The crew sat frozen in place, their hearts pounding from the adrenaline. Everyone okay? Jake's voice cut through the quiet. I'm good, Daniels replied, her voice steady despite the crash. Lyra took a deep breath. We've made it. Now, we need to move fast. The air inside the ship felt heavy as they prepared to disembark. The Anraxi ship was close, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The fortress where the weapon lay was not far, but every second brought them closer to the Anraxi. Jake stood, his eyes steely with resolve. We're here. This is our fight, and we're going to win it. The team gathered their gear, preparing to face the fortress and the deadly enemy that awaited them. The Reverence lay on the rocky surface of the planet, its hull still smoldering from the rough landing. The storm clouds above rumbled with distant thunder, sending occasional flashes of lightning streaking across the sky. The wind howled, carrying the scent of sulfur and the promise of danger. Every step they took beyond the ship would bring them closer to the Anraxi fortress, where the weapon was hidden, and where their fate awaited. Jake stepped out of the ship first, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. He squinted against the storm's fury, trying to make out anything useful in the dim light. The air was thick, and the visibility was low, but they didn't have the luxury of waiting for clear skies. We've got no time, Jake said, his voice low but firm. We move now. Lyra followed closely behind him, her face hard with determination. The fortress is about 5 kilometers from here. We'll need to keep moving fast and stay out of sight. The Anraxi have patrols in this area, and they'll be looking for us. Daniels checked her weapons and pulled a thermal cloak over her shoulders. Let's hope we can stay hidden. Grayson, who had been working the navigation system during the landing, looked up from his datapad. I've pinpointed the location of the fortress. We need to move west. There's a canyon system that should give us some cover, but after that, it's open terrain. The closer we get, the more likely it is we'll be spotted. Jake glanced at the storm raging overhead. It might slow the Anraxi down, but it wouldn't protect them for long. They needed to get to the fortress, retrieve the weapon, and get out, quickly. Stick to the plan, Jake said. We move in silence. Everyone stay close. With that, the crew set off. The landscape was harsh, filled with jagged rocks and swirling dust. The wind stung their faces, and the distant lightning added an eerie glow to the planet's otherwise lifeless surface. As they moved, Lyra led the way, her knowledge of the terrain giving them an edge. Every step she took was calculated, every movement purposeful. Jake kept his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the Anraxi could be anywhere, and the slightest mistake could get them all killed. He kept his hand on his blaster, ready for anything. Hours passed as they made their way toward the fortress. The canyon system was treacherous, with sharp cliffs and sudden drops, but it provided the cover they needed. Every now and then, they heard the distant sounds of Anraxi patrols, the faint hum of their hovercrafts, and the occasional shout as they passed through the canyons. But the crew moved quietly, staying in the shadows and using the storm to mask their movements. Finally, they'd reached the edge of the canyon system, where the landscape opened up into a vast, flat plain. The fortress loomed in the distance, an imposing structure of dark metal and jagged edges, surrounded by tall, watchful towers. The entrance was heavily guarded, with automated drones patrolling the perimeter. There was no way they could just walk in. We'll have to go around, Lyra said, pointing toward a small ridge on the side of the fortress. There's a back entrance, but it's heavily guarded too. We'll need to take out the patrols first. Jake nodded. Daniels, Grayson, you're on lookout. Take out any drones you can from a distance. Lyra, stay with me. We'll get to the entrance. The team took their positions, carefully setting up their gear and preparing for the assault. Jake felt the tension build in his chest. They were so close, but getting in was only half the battle. The real challenge would be getting out with the weapon, and alive. As Grayson and Daniels set up their shots, Jake and Lyra moved closer to the fortress. The ground was rough, and every step was made with careful precision. They had to remain undetected, and the storm helped obscure their movements. But even the storm couldn't mask the rising sense of danger in the air. The closer they got, the more the adrenaline surged through Jake's veins. They reached the back entrance after what felt like an eternity. Lyra checked the access panel, her fingers moving quickly over the control pad. It was locked, but not for long. She had the codes from her previous mission, and they would work now. After a few tense moments, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, Lyra whispered, "Quickly." They slipped into the fortress, the air inside cold and sterile. The walls were made of smooth metal, and the lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It was quiet, too quiet. The sound of their footsteps echoed down the narrow hallways, and Jake could feel his pulse quicken with every step. This was the heart of the Anraxi Empire. If they were caught here, there would be no escape. Lyra led the way, her eyes scanning every corner, every door. She knew the layout of the fortress well, having studied it for months, but the security systems had been updated since then, and the risks were higher than she'd anticipated. The team moved swiftly through the dark halls, using the shadows to their advantage. They encountered no patrols, which made Jake uneasy. It almost felt like they were being watched. But they pushed on, their focus narrowing to the weapon that lay ahead. Finally, they reached the room where the weapon was kept. It was behind a large, reinforced door, with multiple layers of security. But this time, they were ready. Lyra quickly hacked the door's systems, bypassing the locks with ease. The door slid open, revealing a large chamber filled with strange, glowing machinery. In the center of the room stood the weapon, a massive cylindrical structure that pulsed with energy. It was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, an ancient device that seemed to hum with power. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Jake approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the weapon. "This is it," he said quietly. Lyra nodded. "This is humanity's last chance." They moved closer to the weapon, knowing that the real danger was still to come. They had to get it back to the ship, and the Anraxi would stop at nothing to prevent that from happening. Just as they were about to secure the weapon, a loud mechanical screech echoed from the hallway. The alarms were blaring. "We've been detected," Lyra said, her voice filled with urgency. "They're coming." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "Grab it. We're out of here. Now." The fight was just beginning. The alarms blared loudly throughout the fortress. Red lights flashed, casting an eerie glow across the chamber where Jake, Lyra, and the rest of the crew stood frozen. The weapon, pulsing with energy, was now in their hands, but they didn't have much time. The Anraxi would be here any second. "Move," Jake shouted, grabbing the weapon and heading toward the door. He didn't need to say anything more. The crew had already snapped into action. Grayson and Daniels had already positioned themselves by the door, watching for any sign of the approaching Anraxi patrols. They knew what was at stake. "We don't have much time," Grayson muttered, his eyes scanning the hallway. "We'll fight our way out," Jake said, his voice resolute. "Lyra, get us a way out of here." Lyra's fingers flew over her console, working quickly. "There's a service tunnel nearby. It'll lead us to the outside, but it's guarded. We'll need to take out the Anraxi first." "Let's do it," Jake replied, his voice low and steady. There was no room for hesitation now. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder. They were coming. Jake turned to Daniels. "Take the lead. We'll follow." The crew moved into position, with Daniels leading the way. She peeked around the corner, her eyes narrowing, as she spotted the Anraxi patrol. 3 of them, heavily armed, and moving toward them. She signaled to the others, and they took their positions. "On my mark," Daniels whispered. 3, 2, 1. She opened fire first, her shots hitting the first Anraxi soldier square in the chest. The others didn't hesitate. Grayson and Lyra followed suit, their weapons unleashing a deadly barrage of energy blasts. The Anraxi didn't stand a chance. Within moments, the hallway was silent again, save for the faint crackle of the blaster fire that still lingered in the air. "Clear," Daniels said, moving forward. They kept moving, using the shadows to their advantage as they made their way through the fortress's winding hallways. The closer they got to the service tunnel, the more the tension built in Jake's chest. He knew they were running out of time. Every second counted. When they finally reached the tunnel's entrance, Lyra quickly bypassed the security system, unlocking the door. It slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dark, narrow passageway that led to the outside. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice urgent. They moved into the tunnel, closing the door behind them. The cool, damp air of the tunnel felt like a small relief compared to the heated chaos of the fortress. But there was no time to relax. The sound of distant footsteps echoed behind them. The Anraxi were close. They moved quickly through the narrow passage, Lyra leading the way, her sharp instincts guiding them to safety. The tunnel twisted and turned, but she knew it like the back of her hand. The crew stayed close, their weapons ready, their eyes constantly scanning for danger. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened up into a small clearing outside the fortress. The storm above was even more intense now, the wind howling and the rain falling in heavy sheets. But they were outside, and the ship was not far away. "There," Lyra said, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. The Reverence was visible in the distance, sitting like a silent sentinel in the storm. But between them and the ship stood a large group of Anrax's soldiers, blocking their path. Jake clenched his jaw. They were out of the frying pan and into the fire. The Anraxi had them trapped. There was no way around them. "We fight," Jake said, his voice hard with resolve. The crew spread out, taking up positions behind rocks and debris, their weapons aimed at the approaching soldiers. The Anraxi had heavy armor and powerful weapons, but the crew had one advantage. They were desperate, and they had nothing left to lose. The first shots rang out, and the battle began. Blaster fire lit up the stormy night as Jake and his crew fought with everything they had. The Anraxi soldiers moved forward in a well-coordinated assault, their laser blasts ripping through the air. But the crew was faster. They knew this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was the last chance humanity had. Jake ducked behind a large rock, returning fire as a group of Anrax's soldiers tried to flank them. His heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. He couldn't afford to think about failure. Not now. The future of humanity depended on them winning this fight. "Keep them back," Jake shouted, watching as Grayson and Daniels held off the Anraxi from one side. Lyra was providing cover fire, her shots deadly and precise. Every time an Anraxi soldier tried to get closer to their position, she dropped them with a well-aimed shot. It was clear that the Anraxi were relentless, but the crew had something they didn't: each other. Jake's eyes locked with Lyra's for a brief moment. She nodded, signaling that she was ready. They had to move. "Now," Jake shouted. He and Lyra broke cover, charging toward the Anraxi soldiers, their weapons firing. The Anraxi were caught off guard by their sudden aggression. For a moment, they hesitated, and that was all the crew needed. Jake reached the first Anraxi soldier, taking him down with a swift shot to the chest. Lyra followed close behind, her movements fluid and deadly. The crew had gained ground, pushing the Anraxi back. Finally, with one last surge of energy, they broke through the line of Anrax's soldiers and sprinted toward the ship. "Go, go, go," Jake yelled. The crew piled into the Reverence, and Jake slammed the door shut behind them. The engines roared to life, and they lifted off, leaving the stormy surface of the planet behind. "We did it," Daniel said, panting, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. Jake stared out at the stars, the weapons secured, and the Anraxi fortress now a distant memory. They had survived, and humanity's future was safe. For now. "We did," Jake said softly. "But the fight isn't over. We have a long road ahead." And so, with the weapon in their hands, and the hope of humanity resting on their shoulders, the crew of the Reverence prepared for whatever came next.